Hello and welcome back to Receive Them. We are talking about something a bit pressing at the moment. This is in response to the presidential briefing that was earlier this week about autism and some proposed causes from where it comes from, citing several studies indicating an alleged correlation between Tylenol, between vaccines, and autism. And I'm not an expert on the medical aspect. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a statistician. This is not my area. What is my area is the Bible. And what I wanted to take some time to do was to talk about what does all of this have to do with the Bible? How do we as Christians how do we look at this? I'm not so much looking at studies and the medical aspect. What do we do with autism, Tylenol, and the sovereignty of God? What do I think of the recent briefing? My numbers are not my strength. As I said, I'm not a statistician. Statistics are not my wheelhouse in the slightest. It's a foreign language to me a lot of times, and so I will advocate that the statistical aspect of the discussion is not my forte. If you want something more geared towards the quantitative research related to autism, not just that's the medical aspect that we saw recently, but just autism in general. Somebody that has studied this out very deeply, check out Christianity on the Spectrum. John, from what I can tell, is very much a numbers person. That's a channel to check out, Christianity on the Spectrum. But my focus today is how do we think biblically about the issue of causation? Studying out causation when it comes to autism, not just autism, but just in general, is complicated. It is very cross cultural. And what I mean by that is that it's not one category that has this. It's many categories. It's many different kinds of people. There's not one kind of autism. There's not one kind of person who is autistic. And so studying out how this may or may not come about is easier said than done. There are no shortcuts to truth. There is no easy way through any of this. Could there be environmental factors? Maybe. I don't know. But this is a conversation ultimately that needs to be grounded in a worldview that is distinctly Christian. And that is what I want to give some time to today is as we think about the current discussion about autism and what may or may not cause it and what people may or may not have the power to do, ultimately we have to come to the starting point that God has spoken. We have a book. It says this that God has spoken and we are his witnesses. That has to undergird whatever we conclude about that presidential briefing, about what we do moving forwards. That ultimately God has spoken and we are his witnesses. And so the Savoy Declaration, chapter 3, states that God from eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangingly ordained whatsoever cometh to pass. What we think about causes and correlations, wherever we land on that discussion, we have to remember that God rules. Proverbs 21:1 says that the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord's, and that he turneth it whithersoever he will. That whatever we do with the Tylenol discussion, whether we agree with the findings or not, however we think through this, we have to keep at the forefront of our minds that God is sovereign, that God is in control, and that nothing comes to be without his intent. That he from eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, did not outsource any of this, freely and immutably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. What that ultimately means for me is that I am autistic because God is sovereign. And however I feel about that today, however I feel about that tomorrow, that is still true. But John 9, verses 1 through 3 is where I want to camp out for a minute. And these are the words of God. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. That is a question that gets thrown at even today. Why was this man born blind? And in that mindset, in that cultural context, they thought that suffering was invariably the result of actions. That if a person had suffering, if a person had disabilities, let's say, that is invariably the result of sin. That was the worldview that the disciples brought to Jesus. So they asked, whose sin caused the blindness? Mom and dad or this guy? And Jesus turns that on its head. He says neither. The John Piper in his book Disability and the Sovereign Goodness of God says that the meaning of Jesus in John 9:3 is not obscure. He is saying to the disciples, turn away from your fixation on causality as the decisive explanation of suffering, and turn away from any surrender to futility or absurdity or chaos or meaninglessness, and turn to the purposes and plans of God. There is no child and no suffering outside God's purposes. That in the case of the man born blind, Jesus says that it was so in order that the works of God would be made manifest, would be displayed through the blindness. That ultimately the man was born blind for the glory of God. He does not Jesus does not bow to the notion that disability is always the result of external factors. That if you made better decisions, he'd be quote unquote normal. That is not something that Jesus affirms in the slightest in this text. And what it has bearing to how we think through it today. Could there be environmental factors that play into autism? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure anybody knows yet. But what I do know is that if there were environmental factors, God is big enough in his sovereignty that he could have willed them not to be causes. But for reasons I may never fully understand, autism is part of my story. And this is where God has me, is living life, pursuing Jesus on the spectrum. And there's nothing I can do about that because God's sovereign. This is where he's saw fit to put me. And even if it wasn't the autism, it would be something because not all hardships could be mitigated. Not all suffering can be escaped. So if it's not autism, it'll be something. And while there is room I would give that if there were causes found for people to be free to make decisions based on that, knowing that ultimately it is God who wills, it is God who brings things to pass, and it is God who disallows. That even if we did XYZ, we did all the supposed right things, we could still have areas of suffering, hardship, and difficulty because God is sovereign and he does as he pleases. Our God is in the heavens and he does whatsoever he hath pleased. But the Christian worldview shows us that suffering is a teacher. Job 36:22 says, God exalteth by his power, who teacheth like him? Who is there that teaches like God? That is a rhetorical question. But the question points us to the fact that God teaches in a way no one does. That God teaches with material that no one else does. In the hands of God, suffering is not wasted. In the hands of God, weakness is not a negative. In the hands of God, all of this is ultimately for our good. That doesn't mean that everybody becomes president. That doesn't mean that everybody does fill in the blank. But God has made you who you are for his glory. And there is purpose in that. C.S. Lewis once said that pain is God's megaphone. That is something by which he rouses the attention of a sleeping world. And whatever we do with the hardships that are associated with autism, God is in that. God speaks to that. He says that he is our teacher through suffering, that even the pain that we see in life ultimately is subject to his rule, to his way, and to his will. One passage that I find a lot of comfort in is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. And this is a passage that I was meditating on earlier this year after having a meltdown at church. It's not a fun day. But 2 Corinthians 5, verses 8 and 9, it says, "For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, 3 times, that it might depart from me. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." One of the reasons that I really like the King James version is that they use glory as a verb. The word that they're translating tends to come out as something like shine. It's light. It's something like that. And the King James translates that as glory. Oftentimes, modern translations, it's something like rejoice. But I like the idea of glory as a verb, of shining a light on God. And I think that encapsulates what Paul is describing in this text of delighting, of rejoicing, of shining a light on God through his own weaknesses. That is something that I am still learning to do. To glory in my infirmities, that is not something I have entirely figured out. I'm still learning that because hardship is a teacher. And as we work through what was made public to the country earlier this week, whether it proves to be true or not, whether Tylenol is the thing or not, God is still sovereign. Regardless of where this goes, of how this plays out, God is sovereign. And we can rest in that. We can rest that in the hand of God, nothing is truly wasted. And if God does see fit for me to be autistic, it is to his glory. And there is good in that. Even if it means that there's difficulty, that there's suffering, there's hardships. If it means that there are things I may not be able to do, God is still glorified in my weakness. For his strength is made perfect in weakness. And it's easy for me to say that as a level 1 autistic. I know. I know. This is why it's a complex issue with differing factors to consider. That this is what I've seen for me. But maybe you're watching this and you or someone you care about is not a level 1 autistic. Maybe their level of needs is much higher. And you do see the data and you're frustrated, you're hurt, you feel betrayed. And those are all valid feelings. Just know that God is good, that God has you right where he wants you. And ultimately there is good to be found in this. There is rest, there is peace in the arms of Christ for all of us, regardless of where we land on this issue. And all I want to really bring this to is that, like I said, I'm not talking about the numbers. I'm not talking about the science. That's not my area. But what is my area is that Jesus died for me. That I am made in the image of God, autistic or not. that I bear the image of God on this earth in a body that is weak, that is imperfect, a body that I sometimes wish was different. But the sovereignty of God is an anchor to me as I navigate life in the light of His glory, in the light of His grace, as a person on the autism spectrum. And I hope this has been helpful to somebody, that this has been an encouragement to someone, that we can rest in the sovereignty of God in autism, in everything. God bless.